This happened in America. It was legal, and it was written down. It's the spring of 1942. On telephone poles along the American West Coast, notices begin to appear. They're addressed to all persons of Japanese ancestry. Each one gives the families named in it a date and tells them they can bring only what they can carry. The house, the farm, the shop, sold or left with somebody they hope they can trust. They're taken to racetracks first and then to camps in the desert, behind wire with towers that face inwards. By the end, about 120,000 people have been removed. Around 2 out of every 3 are American citizens. Not one has been charged with espionage or sabotage. But here's the strange part. Months before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had already sent a man to find out whether Japanese Americans were a threat. He reported that they weren't. So why did this happen anyway? In the autumn of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt wanted to know whose side Japanese Americans would take if war came. He sent a Chicago businessman called Curtis Munson to find out, working alongside the FBI and Naval Intelligence. His report reached the White House on the 7th of October, 2 months to the day before Pearl Harbor. Munson found them overwhelmingly loyal. On the 7th of December, Japanese aircraft destroyed the American fleet at anchor in Hawaii. 2,400 people were killed. That night, the FBI began arresting community leaders from lists drawn up in advance. Priests, teachers, newspaper editors, taken one at a time by name. That was a police force doing its job. What happened next was not. The man who wrote that sentence was Lieutenant General John DeWitt of the Western Defense Command. 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, there had been no sabotage on the West Coast at all. So he made an argument. In his final report he wrote, "If they attacked, it proved they were dangerous. If they didn't, it proved they were waiting. Nothing they could do would count in their favor."
We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
It said so out loud in its own film while it was doing this. It moved them anyway. It was never really about evidence. Germany and Italy were at war with America too, and 11,000 Germans were interned. Each one got a hearing first. On the West Coast there were no hearings. There was a map and there was ancestry. Then there's Hawaii. More than a third of the territory was of Japanese ancestry on the one piece of American soil that had been attacked. Almost none were removed. The place with the most Japanese Americans nearest the enemy, and the only one bombed, did not do this. On the 19th of February 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. 2 pages, and it never uses the word Japanese. It lets the army draw a line on a map and remove anyone inside it.
Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration.
Cheerfully. That's the word the government chose in 1943 for people registering to be taken away. A week to sell a farm, a week to empty a house and work out what a life weighs. The buyers knew the deadline too. Refrigerators went for a few dollars, and farms built over 30 years went in an afternoon. A government commission later put the loss at $4 billion in today's money. People burnt things, letters in Japanese, photographs of relatives in Japan, anything that might look like evidence to somebody who came looking. Soldiers with rifles put them onto buses and trains, and their neighbours stood on the pavement and watched them go. Camps weren't built yet, so the first stop was a racetrack where families were put in the horse stalls. There were 10 of them, and every one was somewhere nobody else wanted. Manzanar, Two Lake, Hart Mountain, Topaz, tar paper barracks, latrines with no partitions, dust that came through the walls. They started schools, they planted gardens in ground that grew nothing, they played baseball.
The people are not under suspicion. They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war.
But the wire and the towers faced inwards. On the 11th of April, 1943, at Topaz, a 63-year-old chef called James Wakasa was walking near the fence. A private shot him dead from a tower 300 yards away and called it a warning. The authorities' own investigators found the body inside the wire, and the post-mortem found Wakasa was facing the tower. The guard was acquitted. 4 months earlier, at Manzanar, soldiers had fired into a crowd and killed 2 more. So no, it wasn't the Holocaust. It was the United States holding 120,000 of its own people behind wire without charging them and shooting the ones who came too close. Better than the Nazis is not a standard, it's an excuse. February 1943, the government handed every adult in the camps a loyalty questionnaire. Question 28 asked whether you would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. For the American-born, it asked them to renounce a loyalty they had never had, to admit to it in order to give it up. For their parents it was worse. American law had barred them from ever becoming citizens. So the government was ordering people it would not naturalize to renounce the only nationality allowed them. Answer yes, and you belong to no country on earth. Thousands answered yes. About 1,500 volunteered straight out of the camps into a segregated unit that lost more than 800 men in the Vostens Mountains, while their parents were still behind wire in Wyoming and Arkansas. Both answers were right. There was nothing correct to write on that form because the form should never have existed. A clerk was suing the United States. Her lawyer had gone looking for a plaintiff the government could find nothing to say about, and he found Mitsuye Endo. Endo had never been to Japan, and her brother was serving in the United States Army. She filed for habeas corpus in July 1942, the simplest question in law. By what authority are you holding me? The government's answer was to offer her a way out. Leave the camp, just don't go back to the West Coast. She said no. If she walked out, she'd be free, the case would be over, and everybody else would still be inside. So she stayed, 2 more years to keep a lawsuit alive. On the 18th of December 1944, the Supreme Court ruled for her, unanimously. The government had no authority to hold a citizen it agreed was loyal. Somebody in Washington had been told what was coming. The day before the ruling, the War Department announced it was ending the exclusion anyway, so letting them go read as a decision, not a defeat. And the same morning it ruled for Mitsuye Endo. The same court ruled against Fred Korematsu, 6-3. The removal itself was constitutional. Justice Frank Murphy dissented, writing that the exclusion fell into what he called the ugly abyss of racism. It was the first time that word had appeared in a Supreme Court opinion. He was outvoted. They went home to sold farms and signs telling them not to come back. Many had no home at all. Then in 1981, 2 researchers went through the government's own files in the National Archives. They found what the Justice Department had known in 1944. Naval Intelligence and the FBI had reported there was no evidence of the espionage the government claimed. The Navy's own Japanese specialist had written that the problem was magnified out of proportion, largely because of the physical characteristics of the people. The government had that in its hands. It edited the report it handed the Supreme Court and left the rest out. Korematsu was decided on a record the government had cleaned first. That same year, a congressional commission reported on why it had happened. 3 reasons: race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the apology into law, an admission, in writing, that it had been wrong. Congress gave the bill a number, House Resolution 442, the number of the regiment. Mitsuye Endo won the case that opened the camps. She moved to Chicago, married another former prisoner, and raised 3 children. In her whole life, she gave 1 interview about it. Her own children didn't know what their mother had done until they were adults. The government asked the question in 1941. It had its answer 2 months before the war started, and it still took 47 years, and 1 clerk who would not leave to say so out loud.